Hi, I'm Jennifer Morris, CEO of the Nature Conservancy and a proud SIPA alum. And I'm delighted to be part of today's program. It's fitting that this year's event is focused on climate, because no matter where you work or what industry or sector you are in, the climate emergency affects all of us. The climate crisis isn't just an environmental issue, it's an everything issue. And we have years, not decades, to address it. While the odds seem greater than ever, leaders like all of you are what give me hope. For more than 70 years, SIPA has built exactly the kind of global thinking and spirit of collaboration that we need to beat those odds. Today's event is a celebration of the SIPA community and the impact SIPA alums are making on climate change and other critical challenges around the world. We have an incredible lineup of panelists joining us today for an engaging conversation on our collective work. Thank you again for your leadership and enjoy today's event.
Greetings, everyone. My name is David Sandalow, and I am the inaugural fellow at the SIPA Center on Global Energy Policy and co-director of the Energy and Environment Concentration at SIPA. And I am just delighted to be here today to moderate a panel on the topic of climate change. I want to start by thanking Dean Tom Christensen, who's somebody I've learned from for many years, a leading scholar on China here in the United States and a tremendous interim dean here at SIPA. And congratulate both Nicole and Sumant. As Dean Christensen said, those videos were incredibly inspiring, and that's because the work that Nicole and Sumant have done is just incredibly inspiring. I'm going to introduce our panel in a moment. Before I do that, I just want to set the stage in talking about climate change, which is the topic we'll be discussing today. And I'm going to start with some bad news and then go to some good news. The bad news is that the concentration of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere today, globally, is at the highest level in millions of years. That is an uncontroversial finding from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the human race, I think most scientists believe, a couple of 100,000 years old. So we are right now in a world in which the concentration of heat-trapping gases in our atmosphere is literally higher than it has ever been in all of human history. We're seeing the impacts of that. The warmest 7 years ever recorded were the last 7 years. The average temperatures over the course of decades has been increasing for each of the past 5 decades. And we're seeing impacts around the world. In this country, in the United States, we've seen devastating wildfires prompted in part by climate change. We've seen remarkable concentration of rainfall in some places, which is exactly what scientists predict as a result of global warming. We had a rainstorm in Houston in which 36 inches of rain were dumped on the city of Houston in just a couple of days, and many other examples as well. And we've seen impacts like this around the world. And final piece of bad news, the concentration of these heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere continues to increase. We know what needs to be done, that is, the world needs to stop and then reverse the growth of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, but that is not happening. Global greenhouse gas emissions dropped slightly at the depth of the pandemic, but have continued a steady upward surge in recent years with that minor exception. That's the bad news. The good news is that we have global consensus reflected in an agreement adopted by more than 190 countries about what needs to be done. And that's not an easy thing to do. And we have mobilized people all over the world to begin to address this problem. We've seen remarkable developments in some clean energy technologies, most notably solar and wind power. The cost of solar power today is about 10% of what it was a decade ago. Cost of wind power is down by a third to a half in that time period. And related to that, we're seeing enormous growth in the deployment of those technologies. We're seeing increasing attention from young people all over the world, which is going to be absolutely critical to solving this long-term problem. And we have institutions like SIPA, where students and faculty are working on a wide range of energy and climate change solutions. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I should say, alumni students and faculty are working on a wide range of energy solutions because we have really remarkable alumni working on this topic. And so with that, let me bring in our panelists, if we could do that. If everyone could turn on their cameras, and let me introduce all of you. Really, thank you all for joining us. I think joining from a number of different places around the world. We have, I'll start with Kerry Constabile, who is the lead for sustainability strategy engagement at Google. Welcome, Kerry. Andrea Vivero, who is a managing partner at Meridio Consulting and a former senior policy advisor to the mayor of Quito, Ecuador. I should have said Kerry is an MIA from 2006, and Andrea is an MPA from 2010. We have ZiZhu Zhang, who is a current student getting her MPA at SIPA and a former environmental journalist at Caixin Weekly and with Hong Kong's Phoenix Television. And last but very much not least, we have Dean Wolfram Schlenker, who you've already heard from, who is Vice Dean for Academic Affairs at SIPA, a professor and co-director of SIPA's Center for Environmental Economics and Policy, and a former co-director of the Energy and Environment concentration at SIPA. So welcome, everyone. For everyone in the audience, please, you can submit questions in the Q&A down at the bottom of the Zoom link here. My guess is that most of you are pretty familiar with that, but just go to the button and send a question in if you have a question for any of us, and we'll work them into the conversation. Let me start with you, Kerry. And as a reminder, Kerry is the lead for sustainability and strategy engagement at Google, one of the world's largest companies. So let me start kind of asking about the role of the private sector, where you now work. What do you think are first? I think I'd be interested to know what you're doing at Google on climate change issues, and what do you think broadly are the opportunities for the private sector in fighting climate change?
Thanks, David, and it's great to be back always at SIPA and join the Alumni Day. So thank you so much for the invitation. So I lead sustainability strategy and engagement at Google, and lead many different parts of climate strategy for the company. My prior role was working on climate and energy for the UN Secretary General for about 7 years, from the Paris Agreement to 2020. The role of the private sector, so I'm in a very different role these days than I was when I was doing UN policy, and but obviously, you know, quite critical these days to be on the private sector implementation side. I would say the role of the private sector at this time has really shifted. It's in the past, it was really focused on purely implementation, operational leadership, renewable energy, net zero goals, etc. These days, I think what's really critical for the private sector, and something that Google is quite proud of, is that there are multiple dimensions of leadership that the private sector needs to take on. And essentially, it's the responsibility of the private sector to embed climate solutions throughout the DNA of the company. I'll give Google as the example. We have essentially three top line priorities. The first is leading at Google, so operational leadership. Net zero commitments, which entail reducing very strong greenhouse gas reduction targets across all scopes, which is critical. Google has a longstanding history of leading on renewable energy, clean energy purchasing. We've been doing power purchase agreements since 2010 and really showing demand so that the prices will come down. And that's all very critical. The really cleaning your own house and leading on net zero and greenhouse gas reduction is vital. At the same time, it gets almost too much attention, I would say, from my personal vantage point, these days. And the other dimensions of how companies can directly or indirectly influence through their products and services doesn't get enough attention. So in addition to operational leadership, which is critical, Google also leads in enabling partners. And that is we work very closely with policymakers, cities, other businesses, provide Google Earth services. We develop a lot of different innovations like Project Sunroof, and where we really take it as a responsibility to enable partners to mitigate, measure, and visualize emissions so that they can help the world reduce at the accelerated pace that we need. See, the third pillar, and this doesn't apply to all companies, it really depends on what sector you're in, but for Google, it's a highly consumer-facing company. And being that close to the consumer, we feel we have a responsibility to both enable emissions reductions from consumers and make it extremely transparent where the emissions are. And so we've begun to embed the emissions information and also alternative solutions throughout all of our products, from Google Maps to Google Flights. I'm sure that's a lot of what you can see on Google search. You search climate change, you get IPCC information, so that the best sources of climate science information are there. So we're constantly innovating across all three of these dimensions, leading for our own company, leading on net zero, leading on GHG reductions, on energy, leading on partner products, and making it possible for the world to do this as quickly as possible. And then also doing as much as we can to shift behavior change for consumers.
Thank you, Kerry. That is quite a combination of activities that Google's engaged in, and we'll come back and talk about some of them. And you mentioned, as one piece of this, you mentioned cities, and that's something, Andrea, that you've been deeply involved in. And I think I've worked for the mayor of Quito and now have a consulting firm in this area. Can you tell us about your thoughts on the role of cities in the fight against climate change?
Thank you, David, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me for this great conversation. So today, 55% of the world's population lives in cities, and by 2050, it's projected that it will reach 68%. Cities consume 78% of the world's energy, and it is in cities where 70% of the world's CO2 emissions take place. So therefore, countries would not be able to meet their NDCs or the Paris Agreement without an effective role from cities in tackling climate change. So it is in cities where the battle against climate change needs to be fought. But for cities to effectively address climate change, they need to invest a huge amount of resources in climate resilient infrastructure. But this amount is huge. It's estimated that it will cost between 4.5 and 5.4 trillion per year to build low emission and climate resilient infrastructure in cities. So as you see, this is a huge investment that cities need, and cities do not have direct access to the resources needed to implement these projects across their localities. The main obstacles the cities have to tackle climate change is they don't have direct access to international finance. Many cities are banned from borrowing. They depend on their national governments to issue national sovereign guarantees in order to access these resources. And it is shocking to see that only less than 20% of the largest 500 cities in the developing world are deemed creditworthy. So these are some of the challenges they have.
Thank you, Andrea. Let's turn to China. There is no country that's more important in the world when it comes to climate change. Last year, roughly 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions came from China. That's more than emissions from the United States, Europe, and India combined. And ZiZhu, you have reported on climate change from China. I wonder, could you talk about what does the Chinese public think about climate change, and what's the level of awareness in China about climate change and attitudes about this topic in China?
Thank you, Professor Sandalow, for the question, and hello, everyone. So my name is ZiZhu. I've reported on climate change and environmental issues back in China between 2018 and 2020. So from what I have observed, in general, I think people started to care more about the issue of climate change just because the topic has become more of a widely discussed topic worldwide, and there has been more press coverage about it, also domestically. And from a reporting point of view, I think journalists and editors in China will often say, when we cover international issues such as climate change, we tend to think that we need like a China angle to be able to engage the Chinese audiences to make things more appealing to them. So in that sense, I think in the past few years or decades like that, China's increasing participation in international climate negotiations and now trying to position itself as a leader in the global fight against climate change certainly facilitated awareness and consensus among the Chinese society. However, I think the development of public awareness on climate change might only accelerated in the past decade. And then we all know that climate change is not just about cutting carbon emissions. It's also about food, transportation, basically the way we eat, the way we travel, and connected to every aspect of the way we live. But topics like this, I think, haven't gained enough attention in China, mostly because the good narrative between climate change and how they could impact like people in China's life are still missing. And the food system, for example, I would say the environmental impact on food producing countries might not be felt strongly by the consumers in other countries on a day-to-day basis. But I believe that as China's purchasing power increases, I think this kind of discussion about, for example, food and climate, and also China's overseas investments in energy will become more and more relevant to China and more frequently discussed in China. But so far, I haven't seen this topic been talked enough. And practically, I think it's just a difficult thing to tell, because doing my previous work, I work a lot with like NGOs and industry peoples. I think a lot of NGO groups or advocacy group, they might try to run campaigns to raise awareness for the public, and then they will have numbers to say that how many people they have reached through those kind of campaigns. But in China, I think because the social media space is kind of it's very diverse, and then people prefer different like platform to voice their own opinion, and it's very hard to tell how the Chinese public actually think just through internet comments. So I think it's just they're part of truth still. We're not sure how this trend has been going.
I want to come back to these issues because policy is so important for addressing climate change, and policy is really depends upon public perceptions in many ways, no matter what the political system. But let me turn to Dean Schlenker and Wolfram. Thank you for joining us. And Wolfram, as many people know here, is a leading scholar on many of these issues, and particularly economic issues related to climate change. And I wondered, could you just offer some thoughts about market-based approaches to addressing the climate issue? And what do economists recommend for addressing this issue, and how widespread are those solutions globally today?
Thank you, David, for having me. And I should mention that one of the greatest joys of being a professor at SIPA, like sort of seeing the graduates from SIPA going out there and basically having a real world impact. So it's really great to be on this panel, and I feel very honored to be here. I think I would like to make sort of 3 quick points, sort of following up what others have said. So I guess the first point is sort of, I'm very impressed, like Kerry mentioning what's happening at Google, or Andrea, what's happening in like individual cities. But going back to what David said at the beginning, sort of the problem is as great as it is, as Jennifer Morris said, that we all have to sort of work on this because it's such a life-changing problem. we're still going up instead of going down. We don't even have the slope right. So while I think it's amazing that we sort of have all those different initiatives, I do believe we need some really strong public policy responses too, to give further incentives to companies to do it. I don't want to belittle what they're doing. I think it's great and everything, but given that we're still going up instead of going down, we sort of have to have some policy parameters that sort of put us into a better world. And so as David said, so as an economist, I as my second point, we like to favor sort of a market-based approaches. They're actually gaining quite a bit of traction. So the World Bank, for example, has a greenhouse gas inventory tracker, and they now state that about 21.5% of 2021 emissions are actually covered by carbon regulation, carbon prices. So it's substantial by now. It's about a fifth of the world's emissions. Now that masks though that there's huge heterogeneity. So if you, for example, look at the European Union alone, Poland has a carbon price of like 16 cents per ton of CO2, while Sweden has one of $128 per ton of CO2. That's like a vast difference, right? Like the 16 cents is like less than a cent per gallon of gasoline, if you sort of want to translate it into more intuitive unit. Sweden's price is actually more than $1 per gallon of gasoline. So there's huge ranges. And I understand, and I think this is why I want to come back to ZiZhu's point. It's really important sort of how the public thinks about this. We often hear about, the negative effect of carbon pricing or any high energy prices on economic growth. And that sort of brings me to my third and final point. There's more and more research that actually suggests that carbon prices can be substantial in reducing CO2 without really negatively affecting the economy. So for example, in the European Union, where we have the EU ETS, there's a funny, like individual countries had some leeway in how they implemented it. And France did this funny thing where they basically regulated all companies that had a boiler that were bigger than 20 megawatts and didn't regulate anybody below 20. So if you're a company who has two 15 megawatt boilers, you're not regulated under ETS. If you have one 30 megawatt boiler, you are regulated. Now, from a researcher perspective, this is really ideal because you have basically two companies which are having the same amount of generation, 30 megawatts, but one is regulated, one not. And so there's a really path-breaking new paper that basically shows that comparing those regulated to non-regulated, that the regulation actually reduced the CO2 emissions by 8 to 12%. Again, it's not like humongous, but the carbon price in Europe isn't that high. It's like hovering around $30, but at least some modest progress. At the same time, they look at firm output, competitiveness, and all these other things, and they don't find any negative effects. And there's even studies looking at this globally. The current carbon prices that we see, I think, are sort of modestly successful in reducing CO2, while not really negatively impacting industry. So I really defer to the panel. You're much more salient and much more better at this than I am, but I think convincing the public that this actually might be a useful tool and steering us in the right direction might be quite useful.
Just listening to all of our panelists talk reminds me of one thing that's so remarkable about SIPA, which is just the diversity of backgrounds, the diversity of viewpoints, the diversity of perspectives, and for me, it's just one of the constant excitements about being at this school. I want to remind everybody listening that if you'd like to engage in the conversation, please, ask a question in the Q&A below at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We have some remarkable people listening. So we have some remarkable alumni here at SIPA. So if you'd like to enter into the conversation, please do it. And Kerry, I'm going to come back to you and kind of ask about your background and at the UN. You referred to your years working at the UN, and you had some pretty interesting high-profile positions working on the Paris Agreement, among some other things. Maybe you could just relate what that experience was, and any thoughts about the UN as an institution and its role in helping to address this problem of climate change.
Yes, of course, David, and just want to briefly reply to Wolfram as well. That it could not underestimate the importance of policy, and it is, I think there is a lot of focus on what private sector can do, and there's a huge role catalytic role that private sector can play in terms of pushing standards and policies, etc. At the same time, it is an indirect influence. And so I think that is one of the challenges of private sector leadership. It is indirect in terms of policy, and we do still lack that policy certainty in terms of prices, in terms of standards. So couldn't agree with you more in terms of that importance. I think then comes to the UN. So personally, I was at the UN from 2014 for the Secretary General's Climate Summit in 2014, which catalyzed a lot of really exciting both non-state action, so city and private sector, and then also a lot of obviously national government action, U.S.-China agreement. I think I actually worked with Andrea at some point during my time there with the mayor of Quito at the time. And through so we did a lot of sort of prepping and mobilization of the whole of society in 2014 and 2015 before the actual agreement, and the reason for that was because of the need for a whole of society approach in terms of raising national ambition and getting to a deal, but also because this is an all hands on deck crisis. So my experience at the UN, I think the UN plays a really important role in terms of mobilization of whole of society, identifying opportunities for investment, for gap filling, there's a lot of work, exciting work underway right now where the UN is really assessing net zero pledges by private sector and by others, which is very necessary. So it's really raising the bar and holding society to a higher standard, and consistently reminding all aspects of society that this is a crisis like no other. In terms of the Paris Agreement itself, I think there are a lot of successes since the Paris Agreement. Now, yes, it's completely insufficient, and where we are today completely, and we're so I think that is one of the biggest successes of the Paris Agreement, is that it is a bottom-up agreement, and what it is, what was embedded in the agreement was an every 5-year ratcheting up mechanism. So the nationally determined contributions every 5 years need to significantly increase in ambition. The world and the UN has accelerated that pathway. So now, the goal was to increase, NDC ambition as much as possible by Glasgow. It was determined that was insufficient, and so now we are going to Sharm in COP27 with another NDC, ambition raising process. And so that's really important, that this is a flexible agreement. There is incremental ambition raising embedded in it. And I think it is very important to recognize that we are nowhere near solving climate, but we have accomplished some really important successes since. One is during the Paris Agreement, 1.5 was the 1.5 degrees, and that threshold was not normalized. It was by any means, right? It was a real success that the Paris Agreement mentioned 1.5 as a goal. Today, all aspects of society are talking about needing a 1.5 alignment pathway, and that's very significant. Now, it's still insufficient, but it's very important. And I would say that the second area that we've increased, ambition on is really the financial sector. I think there's significant trillions mobilized, and again, insufficient, and some of the accounting really needs to be looked at for that, but still, new financing has definitely, been mobilized, and Glasgow, that was a big success of Glasgow. And financial regulation, so the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the embedding of climate risk for financial institutions. It's going to be very hard to find a bank these days that does not have climate risk and really, very strong standards on measuring risk and measuring the transitional risk that the company and its scope 3 faces with respect to climate embedded in its business. And it's a really good start.
Thank you. Andrea, I want to come to you and ask about the role of policy in addressing some of the financing challenges for cities that you spoke about. But before turning to you, I just want to offer some quick thoughts of my own on this policy question, because I completely agree with the point that Wolfram and Kerry were making about the importance of policy in addressing climate change. And sometimes in the political dialogue in this country, we hear people say, "Oh, what we just need innovation." And innovation will help solve this problem. And to a certain extent, I think that captures part of what's needed. We do need innovation, certainly in energy technologies and food systems and much more. But innovation is not necessarily clean energy innovation. There are plenty of innovations that can happen that don't promote a low carbon future. I mean, for example, large offshore oil platforms, which are able to produce oil from the deep ocean, are a remarkable technological innovation that wasn't possible 30 years ago. It is today, but it's not a clean energy innovation. And my own view is that we need policy to guide innovation toward a low carbon future. And without the policy signals, innovation may head in other directions. So welcome. Any thoughts on that? And then, Andrea, I wonder, and you made this, again, really interesting point about the challenges that cities have raising funds in this area. I wonder if what you would recommend by way of a solution there.
Yeah, sure. So the international financial architecture was not designed for cities. It was designed for countries. So it is really difficult for them to provide direct access to funding for cities because they required a national guarantee, which in most cases is highly politicized. It's a highly politicized process. If the mayor doesn't get along with the president, this guarantee won't be granted. So it's really hard for cities to access the funds needed. There has been a lot of initiatives like to improve credit worthiness of cities. For example, World Bank has a great initiative on this. But as I mentioned before, only 20% of the 500 largest cities in the developing world are deemed credit worthy. Also, from the demand side, cities have a lack of project.
Yep. Oh, you're back. Yep, you just froze. No problem. Just froze for a moment. Yep.
Yeah. So I was saying that from the demand side, cities have a lack of project preparation. They have unstable fiscal policies. They depend on the national government transfers to build their own projects, the climate related projects. So in the last decade, there has been new bonds, new funds, new financial facilities for cities, but it's not enough because as I mentioned before, the investment gap is huge and a lot of resources are needed. So we need resources from the international financial system, from the private sector, from all over to meet the infrastructure, or the climate resilient infrastructure needed to tackle climate change. So as you see, it's a really big issue. And as Kerry was saying, that COP was a great success in announcing more financing, but not for cities. Like, we were really encouraged by COP that the mayors were invited to a lot of sessions. I think this COP was the largest, had the largest participation of mayors ever, but the announcements on the financial sector and the commitments were just mere, it's like a C40 announcement for electric mobility and then a pledge from the UK to finance some climate projects, but that's it. So there's much more to be done if we really need to tackle climate change, it's because cities are a really important part of this. So yeah.
Thank you, Andrea. So ZiZhu, I've spent a lot of time going back and forth to China, at least before the pandemic. And one thing I found is that understanding of Chinese society in the West is often pretty poor. And we've been talking about the role of companies and the role of civil society and in the climate change issue globally. I wonder, could maybe just say a few words about how that works in the Chinese system and what role the companies play in the climate change issue in China, what role the NGOs play in addressing climate change there.
Sure. I think I'm happy to talk about how, like particularly like Chinese NGO, how they sort of, interact with the, society policymaker on the topic of climate change. I think Chinese NGO, through the, my experience, like working with them, I think they play a very significant role in promoting, sustainability and awareness on climate change. I think one example is that in late 2000s, when, climate change wasn't the most mainstream policy topic in China, like international NGOs, such as, WWF was already promoting the idea of low carbon cities and then help, selected, city government to collaborate with and then to help them to set the, emission reduction goals even before the central government, the central governmental policies of low carbon cities came into being. So many NGOs nowadays still, they're very actively in communicating with the private sector on emission reduction and spoke with them about how to invest their overseas, energy project more sustainably, etc. So currently we see that as the Chinese central government set more refined climate goals and different targets for decarbonization, many local governments actually have more needs to understand better how they could best implement these goals, such as what sectors to focus on first and what quantifiable goals to set. And because of, I think different localities have different natural resources and they have, different, economic structure. So that's how many NGOs in China came to agreement with local governments and try to advise them with policy and technical expertise on how to achieve these climate goals, say how to pick the carbon emissions more effectively without harming other local policy objectives. So during this process, I think NGO, they are also trying to advise local government to align their understanding on climate change more closely with the international consensus, such as setting the goal at a more ambitious level, say in consistency with like the 1.5 degree goal. I think in summary, I think the commitment of Chinese central government on climate change is very strong. And when the conditions is right, I think the system is able to mobilize the right resources to achieve these goals. But during this process, I think it's possible that local government face conflicting policy objectives. I mean, for example, especially after COVID, I think like some local governments, they struggle to stay with the GDP growth goals at the same time to keep the promise on carbon emission reduction at the same time. So they will need a lot of advice and guidance on this. I think this kind of flexible space that has created a lot of opportunity for many Chinese NGO to work in this space.
Thank you. And for those who have joined late, my name is David Sandalow. I'm co-director of the Energy and Environment Concentration at SIPA. I'm here with SIPA alumni Kerry Constabile, Andrea Vivero, and ZiZhu Zhang, and Vice Dean Wolfram Schlenker. And we're talking about climate change. And Wolfram, I thought maybe we turn to kind of current events of the day and talk about what's happening, kind of breaking news. And one thing we've seen in the past month, as fuel prices have climbed around the world, we've seen calls to suspend gasoline taxes, calls to suspend fuel taxes in many countries around the world. I wonder what you think about those ideas. And does that imply that we should also waive or suspend carbon taxes as a response to these rising fuel prices?
Thanks, David. So, we also have there was a question in the chat as well on like Ukraine and what the effect is. I mean, as dire, I don't want to talk about the war because it's a very dire thing, obviously. But in a way, my background is I'm from Germany, and I think some countries actually learn through this whole experience right now. Now, Germany is very, very dependent on natural gas imports from Russia. that it might be not as good to be as fossil fuel dependent on other countries. So I think, you know, the question in the chat box was like whether this overshadows climate change. And yes, I think the war gets a lot of attention right now, but I think at the same time, for a lot of fuel importing countries, it might also sound a little bit of an alarm that you don't want to be too dependent on like fuel exporters. And in that sense, I know at least in Europe, there's a lot of discussion how they want to even further start their own renewable sector and so forth. So if you want to be optimistic, maybe it also gives you a chance to sort of see this as a chance for countries to realize, man, let's do something about this. We don't want to be dependent from a geopolitical perspective on exporters we don't necessarily can trust. Now, as a result of this war, you know, the fuel prices have gone up, and I'm very like, you know, very, very cautious on saying let's get rid of the carbon tax or getting rid of the fuel tax, because the problem we have right now is sort of an imbalance of demand and supply. So what happens is that the price rises high enough that the demand is sort of reduced enough to meet supply. If you basically suspend the fuel tax, all what you're doing is you're increasing demand again, then demand outstrips supply again. And what happens is that the producers can raise the price to basically get back to supply and demand. So in the end, what you're basically doing is by suspending fuel taxes, as well as the intention might be is to help people who have a hard time paying the bills, is that you're just giving the fuel tax to the producers, which can now charge more. So I'm very much, I think this is sort of a topic that's very popular among politicians. They say like, let's help our people. Let's basically, you know, suspend the fuel tax. I don't think this is how it works. If you suspend the fuel tax, it's just the producers raise the price by the same amount more to get demand and supply back in equilibrium. So in the end, you just make the oil companies richer. And I don't think this is sort of a goal we should sort of explain this to the constituents. But David, you should weigh in too. I feel like you're like the preeminent expert you wrote a book on Chinese climate policy. Do you have any thoughts? I mean, don't hold back. I feel like not just us chiming in.
Oh, that's dangerous to ask me, Wolfram. I have lots of thoughts. Let me just, I will weigh in on the question you were just responding to about the impact of the Ukraine war and climate change and clean energy issues. And first, I think to a first order of approximation, I think that what's happening, that the tragedy that's happening right now in the Ukraine and Russia is likely to accelerate the clean energy transition in Europe and slow it down in Asia. And I'm less sure about other continents, but I think, and I welcome any views on this, but from what I've observed in Europe, there's a lot of dialogue along the lines of what you were saying, Wolfram, that this demonstrates the importance of the transition to clean energy. We need to get off of fossil fuels. We're no longer reliant on fossil fuel imports. In the short term, I think there may be some increased, reliance on natural gas from other countries, including the United States. But I think there's a big push towards accelerating the clean energy transition as a result of this crisis. In Asia, in contrast, and particularly in China, we've seen increased natural gas prices, that are quite dramatic in the past year, and that's slowing down the transition away from coal, I think. And so I think that, and that's true in some other countries in Asia as well. So I think the effect of this may be to slow down the energy transition in Asia some. We had a really good question in the chat that you were referring to, and one of our audience members asked about essentially, does this crisis make climate change a secondary issue? And I think in some countries around the world, the answer is yes, that this does mean that the current crisis means that climate change will get less political attention. There's a kind of saying about the urgent crowding out the important. What's happening in Ukraine right now is both urgent and important, but this is, in my view, one of the core challenges of climate change as a policy issue, and it's one reason that studying the policy of climate change is so important at places like SIPA. But climate change is a problem that's caused by invisible and odorless gases, and it happens on timeframes that are slow in the experience of many people, although scientists say they're faster than have ever happened in human history. And that just makes it very hard to deal with as a political issue. That's just kind of the bottom line, and that's the part of the reality of this issue. I welcome any thoughts from any of the panelists, and I wanted to come back to you, ZiZhu, because to just say a word about your experience as a reporter in China. So I think that might be of great interest to our audience. And you worked in China and for Chinese news outlets as a reporter working on this issue, and particularly since public opinion is so important. Just you say a word about what that experience was and what it's like working as a reporter in the Chinese system now.
Yeah, sure. I think reporting on climate change, one of the challenge, I would say, while I was in China, but I mean, this might not be unique to Chinese media. I think that, traditional journalism is mostly attracted to, dramatic reality events, that we can see like a tangible sort of impact to the public that can be materialized through, different form of, media coverage. But in the case of climate change, I think the consequences sometimes might not be the most immediate and tangible. I mean, in the past few years, we have seen a lot of, extreme like weather events, such as, hurricane and floods across the world, which embodies more tangible impacts that for the reporter to report on. But some of the scientific reports, research findings, and also the how to sort of report on international climate, international governance on climate change, that has been I found that more difficult to be pictured through like traditional form of reporting. I think in China specifically, I mean, we face the same kind of constraint because in the earlier days, I think effective environmental reporting was majorly about uncovering pollution events, and reporters are in general more motivated to pursue this kind of story because they feel like they could hold actions of the spoilers, such as local governments or companies accountable. And but this kind of like causal link is harder to be joined in the case of climate change, I would say. And I think more to this, to China's own, media environment, I think, since I think media in China need to sort of operate within, certain limits, I think that media itself might also prefer to stick to the stories that they could demonstrate evidence of the damages and then trace the actions back to the spoilers rather than taking a value position without knowing how much public consensus is out there. So I think, on the role of coal, for example, I think from the power shortages in, Northeast China last year to the, Russia, Ukraine war we just talked about, I think the Chinese government, we've seen that the government has like shifted to like a more, fortified attitude towards, energy security. But that doesn't mean the Chinese government, China's climate commitment has been, weakened in any sense. So I think that the vagueness of the Chinese policy language, like sometimes provide the space for industrial experts and NGOs to interpret future direction of the government policies. And then what interview resources and discussion that journalists and media can access to will sort of, to a certain extent, like determine where this kind of story will go.
Thank you, ZiZhu. Very interesting. And Andrea, we have two questions in the chat for you. So let me, and others may want to weigh in as well. But Habib Eniyatullah, I hope I'm pronouncing that roughly correctly. But Habib asked the following question. He says, as cities in developing countries build new infrastructure, expressways in Nairobi or Dhaka, for example, how can climate considerations be built into these new projects on a proactive basis? Building new infrastructure is easier than retrofitting existing infrastructure. Perhaps Andrea could talk about how Quito is building climate into their projects at an implementation level.
Yeah, sure. Well, Quito had the first metro system. So that's a great infrastructure project that was the first in the country and in the city. It was built under an innovative financial approach because we had the financing from 4 multilateral banks. we follow the rules from the multilateral banks instead of the national law. So this was more difficult to do, but in the end, it met schedule and time for this great infrastructure project. It was built in 3 years. It's all underground, and it's 22 kilometer, 15 stations. Then for political reasons, it hasn't been inaugurated yet. The former mayor just finished the infrastructure project, and we even had the trains testing, but then the new mayor couldn't decide on who he wanted to operate the system, so it's there. So in the developing world, we have a lot of these political problems as well. So even if we find it with difficulty to finance this great infrastructure projects, then for political reasons, we cannot implement them on time, or there's corruption. So it's a great challenge. And I think the greatest challenge of all, it becomes for intermediary and small cities all over the world. Because if you talk about the largest cities in the world, like New York, Paris, Berlin, etc., you can do a lot of projects, infrastructure projects, build on time, find resources because they are credit worthy, they have access to funding from the private sector, they have all these great regulations in place for private-public partnerships, etc. So the main issue is with this intermediary and small cities, which are the majority in the world. So there has been a lot of organizations and think tanks from all over the world providing technical assistance to cities so they can embed the environmental approach to the infrastructure projects. And of course, it's more expensive now to just retrofit all these infrastructure projects than build them from scratch with an environmental approach.
Do any of our other panelists that want to kind of weigh in on infrastructure issues? I'll just offer the thought that I think this is absolutely essential that we find ways to finance infrastructure that's adapted to coming climate change across a broad range of areas. And that includes physical infrastructure, it includes kind of crop resilience, includes sea level issues. Unfortunately, we as a world are going to be experiencing climate change in the decades ahead. We are committed to it. There's, I think, little we can do to reverse it. And we may be experiencing some pretty severe climate change. And so even as we work to mitigate this and to cut emissions as quickly as possible, I think investing in adaptation is going to be essential for human well-being and health around the world.
David, I have just some follow-up to Andrea's points. I worked on city policy for the Paris Agreement. I was leading a lot of the city mobilization and the attempt to raise the awareness about city finance bottlenecks. And I really want to echo the importance of the lack of city direct subnational climate finance to cities. What Andrea was mentioning earlier, it is so important, and it's so important for this infrastructure issue because, and we've seen it in the initial research done thus far on green recovery plans. There was a lot of, there were sort of two predictions in my view of what would happen for city infrastructure and climate as a result of the COVID crisis. Either a full-scale exodus from cities and quite dramatic, or green recovery plans would catalyze climate actions and fundamentally shift cities to ideally make a lot of the short-lived reductions during COVID long-term. As of today, neither has obviously taken shape, but what we've seen from several of the green recovery plans is that at national level, a lot of that funding just did not get to city level. And so, there is, and we know that the majority of infrastructure, new infrastructure that's going to be implemented from built environment to adaptation infrastructure is going to happen at the municipal level. It is in terms of fiscal constraints and delays at national level, and then especially in the global south, where that infrastructure development is going to be on the rise substantially, as that is where urbanization is taking place. The multilateral system does not have direct windows. If there are direct windows, they are tiny. C40 is doing its best, but it is tiny in comparison to the trillions that are needed at subnational level. And we did try to raise the awareness in Paris. We developed something called the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, which is a very long acronym. But there's some research that's raised awareness of this, but it's really, I can't stress enough, and I no longer work on this directly as I used to, but that really World Bank, regional development banks need to provide direct access to infrastructure financing to cities to enable them to really respond at the pace that is needed.
Thank you, Kerry. And we are down to our last 2 or 3 minutes. We have a question in the chat for you, Andrea, about ESG frameworks. The questioner asks, are there any gold standard ESG sustainability frameworks for public finance that you recommend? And any thoughts broadly about ESG frameworks for municipalities? And maybe we'll just close it out with your thoughts on that question.
Sure. So ESG is a fairly new concept for cities. So it's still being discussed, but by the European Union, and the US has been discussing this for public-owned companies. But still, there's much more to be explored for cities to do this. I don't have direct recommendations for this for cities, because it's a fairly new issue, and there still needs to be seen what direct benefit. I know the benefits, but how can local governments implement this? And I go back to the intermediary and small cities from the world. So the ESG framework is much easier for larger cities to implement, but what about all the rest? So yeah, there's still much more to explore. I guess we should do a benchmarking analysis for how local governments are implementing an ESG framework, and how this is driving more funding to them. How also something that we really need to talk about is how cities need to gain a seat at the global table to discuss these issues at the international arena, and just strengthen them because in order for the world to tackle climate change, we need cities to be heavily involved and investing in all the climate resilient projects that needed to do so.
Well, thank you. Well, let me just close with a point about cities in China, which I know ZiZhu will be familiar with, but the urbanization of China in the past 30 years has been remarkable. And for the first time in the 3,000-year history of China, more than half of the people in China live in cities. In fact, it's up to about 60%. And urbanization has big implications for climate change emissions, for greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of steel, a lot of concrete associated with urbanization. Partly for that reason, the Chinese government has had very ambitious green cities programs and programs that promote green space, that promote energy efficiency in buildings, and many other things. It's been a big focus of Chinese climate change policy, and lots to discuss there if we had more time, which we don't. We are now out of time. I really am so constantly impressed and amazed with the work that's going on the climate change issue at SIPA, and this panel just gives a great snapshot of this. So I want to thank our alumni, our current student, our faculty for joining us, as well as all the organizers of this event. And I will turn the microphone back over to the organizers, and thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Storms, the Director of Alumni Affairs here at SIPA. I want to thank David for leading such an important and informative conversation for us today, and thank our panelists for sharing their experience and deep expertise on this topic, which is so vital for all of our futures. We're very grateful for your time today. Congratulations again to the 2022 SIPA Alumni Award recipients, Suman Sinha and Nicole Vandertine. We look forward to honoring you today in person here on campus. And to our guests who joined us today, we're very pleased you could be here and hope you found the discussion valuable. We look forward to welcoming you again to a future SIPA event. And moreover, we hope that event will be in person, giving you the opportunity to reconnect soon with friends, classmates, and fellow graduates. Thank you all again for joining us today.